Any comparison between the decline of Detroit and the fall of Rome is superficial. They're different stories. Rome's fall was political. Detroit's decline is basically economic. What these cities do have in common, however, is a massive population decline in a very short time. In this way, Detroit's current state, with its many abandoned buildings, is unfortunately a way of showing how Rome may have looked, in some ways, after the fall. Here behind me are two houses abandoned in about 2008, the time of the Great Recession, 15 years ago. As you can see, one is brick and one is wood. In Detroit, decline is seldom natural. There's arsonists, people come in and scrap the metal. But these two houses, with the fair different materials, do illustrate how buildings of different compositions tend to fall apart. The brick house, as you can see, is in much better shape. Its shell is intact, more or less, even though the roof is coming down. Whereas the wooden one, which has suffered some arson, is already almost a shell. Given a decade or two, the house on my right, the brick house, will still exist if it's not torn down. It'll only be a bit of masonry walls and not much more. Whereas the house on my left will be flown into its foundation hole. Rome's smaller buildings, with their masonry walls, would have been much like the house on my right, shells within a few generations of the collapse of Rome. As we'll see, larger buildings had different trajectories of decay. Most of Rome's buildings were insulae, apartment blocks. And here we have one of Detroit's, or technically Highland Park's, many abandoned apartments. This one was built in the 20s and abandoned perhaps 20 years ago. As you can see, despite being scrapped out and boarded up, it's in pretty good shape. It hasn't burned down. Left to decay naturally, which it won't be, this would probably last for quite a long time because, like a Roman apartment block, it has heavy masonry walls and a pretty resilient interior with a few load-bearing curtains. Now, if it's left for a generation, those will collapse gradually inward, leaving a huge masonry shell that might last for a century or more. As we can see, however, the process of decay is much faster if a fire takes place. This apartment was only abandoned about a decade ago, but as you can see, it has burned out, and so it's just a shell with an elevator core sticking out from the rubble. Many of Rome's apartments also burned in the barbarian sacks and the chaos that followed, and would have decayed correspondingly quickly. And what about Rome's most monumental buildings, like the Colosseum or the great temples? For these, I think, the best comparison is the Packard plant, here behind me. Despite being largely empty for half a century, and despite massive looting, scrapping, vandalism, quite a few fires, it stands almost intact, at least the shell does. It's because that frame, with its huge concrete piers, is an analog of the huge blocks and columns that held Rome's largest buildings. The sheer weight and solidity of these structures gives them great longevity, and so, unless looted or overthrown by earthquakes, great Roman buildings can last for millennia, as in fact some have. If the Packard were left alone for century after century, parts would collapse, those concrete floor plates would crack with ice and water intrusion. But the frame would probably endure as long as many of Rome's great temples. But eventually, they all fall down. Every building collapses or is demolished, and you're left with urban prairie, a landscape that resembles, in many ways, what it was before humans came and built their city. Now, here in Detroit, it's a managed sort of prairie. The lawns are largely mowed, and the houses, when they're taken down, are demolished more or less properly, with the debris being taken away. In Dark Age Rome, it was less tidy. Rubble covered the streets, and where the houses had been were these untidy piles of broken brick, covered with grass and then with trees. With time, it became a sort of landscape of hillocks, which was leveled much later for medieval and then Renaissance building. But the effect remains much the same, of a landscape that has reverted to what came before.